Welcome to the Plagues Project.
10 Plagues, Many Angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
The great Hebrew writer Shai Agnon, Hebrew literature's only Nobel laureate, was known perhaps most of all for his accomplishment in taking the entirety of the Jewish bookshelf from the Bible through the rabbinic literature, medieval Hebrew literature, up until the writings of his own day, and distilling it and pouring it out into the mold of modern literature. We see this in a particularly humorous, farcical, almost burlesque short story called The Frogs, which intersects, of course, with our theme of the 10 plagues, the second plague, of course, being the plague of frogs. Here they are, the frogs. Of course, he's both intersecting with the biblical text as well as the rabbinic canon. And he does this in a whole variety of ways and a whole variety of stories. This story, The Frogs, appears in Hebrew in his monumental volume called Ir Umloa, which is a kind of literary testament to his hometown Buchach, a small town in Galicia in what today is Western Ukraine. And in English, it appears in a volume which I edited with my late dear friend, Professor Alan Mintz, A City in Its Fullness, which is part of the Agnon Library from the Toby Press. Agnon is playing off a rabbinic midrash. The midrash teaches Rabbanan Amrei. The rabbis taught, Afilu dvarim shata roeh otan shehen yeterot ba'olam, things in creation which seem to be extraneous. We can look and wonder, why would God have gone to the trouble to create those things? Kigon, zvuvin, parushin, itushim, like flies and fleas and mosquitoes. Afhein bechlal briato shel olamhein. Those two were part of God's plan of creation. Uvakol hakadosh baruch hu oseh shlichuto. God can take everything in creation and use it towards his own ends. Afilu al yedei nachash, afilu al yedei yitosh, afilu al yedei tzfardeya. And things that you might think we could have managed very well without, like snakes. Well, sometimes God has a purpose for having created a snake. See the beginning of the book of Genesis. And even frogs, as we know from the second plague. Agnon is taking this rabbinic idea and he spins it into this very farcical tale called The Frogs, which is a story that was written first in 1956. And we'll take a little tour making many ellipses through the story. And we do encourage you, of course, to read the story in full, either in Hebrew, if you are able, or in the English translation. There was a family in our town who were called the Frogs. Even those of its members who were rich could not escape this moniker. So accustomed were people to using it that even a Gentile, when he would converse with one of them, would address him formally as Mr. Frog, or in the case of a woman, Madame Frog. They simply thought it was their family name and not a slur. You know, that's the way it is sometimes with nicknames. A nickname will stick to its bearer. It once came about in our town that the fishermen raised the price of fish beyond what they were worth, and the poor stopped buying them for their Sabbath meals. Buchach, Agnon's hometown, sits on the bank of the Stripa River, and there was a large market and fresh fish were always available. And since you know Jews like to eat and Jews like to eat fish, it was something that they would consume regularly. And there's a special idea which even appears in the halachic literature, chayav adam lechol dagim b'Shabbat. A Jew must eat fish on the Sabbath. But there was a problem because the fishermen had raised the prices. They were distressed at this curtailment of their ability to enjoy the Sabbath. They went to our master, the esteemed Rabbi Avraham Tuumim of blessed memory, and told him that if he would not issue an injunction forbidding anyone in town from buying fish for the Sabbath until the price came down, they would not be able to enhance their Sabbath pleasure by serving fish. Now, the truth is, this is all historical, and very often Agnon would look into the halachic literature and create a fictional work based upon the DNA, the raw materials that come out of the halachic literature. Rabbi Avraham Tuumim was the rabbi of Buchach, from 1853 until his death in 1868. He was the author of many volumes. For a small Jewish town, Buchach was not a shtetl exactly; it was larger. But for a small town, the place was able to take pride in some of the very many distinguished rabbis that served there. And the Chesed LaAvraham, the name of his book of responsa, contains a section that describes exactly this case, a case that occurred in 1864 when the fishermen, the non-Jewish fishermen in town, had raised the price of fish, and there was an attempt to create a prohibition against buying fish in order to bring down the cost. The rabbi determines, according to halacha, that he is not actually able to forbid those who are able to afford the expensive fish to buy them, but nevertheless he says it's not proper, it's not right to do so. And even though he, the rabbi himself, was a wealthy man, he took no salary from the community, he himself did not buy fish in order to create a kind of social pressure to bring down the prices. And it's a really interesting case because it's an example in the halacha where we see something judged not on the axis of forbidden or permitted, kosher or non-kosher, but on the axis of right and wrong. Technically speaking, it's permitted for a wealthy person to spend a lot of money on these fish, but it's not the right thing to do. The story ends up not being about the rabbi, but about another character. Rabbis are pretty effective, and these rabbis were very well regarded. And had the rabbi ruled that it's forbidden to buy the fish, the townsmen would have stopped buying the fish. But on the technical legal side, he was unable to do so. And therefore, someone else had to come along and get things done. The story is also playing off of a whole variety of satiric writing in the Enlightenment literature, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. Figures such as Yitzhak Erter and Joseph Pearl write stories, and you can find some of their fingerprints left on our tale as well. The idea was that if the fishermen would see that no one was buying fish for the Sabbath, they would lower the price. When 2 Sabbaths passed and the price did not come down, everyone was puzzled. They noticed that the fishermen were casting their nets as usual, and since no one goes to such effort in vain, they concluded that not only Gentiles were buying fish, but the Jews were as well. The town, which numbered probably around 10,000 people at the time the story is set, was about 60% Jewish. An investigation into the matter revealed that there was one house in town where the smell of fish was always present, not only on Sabbath, but even during the week. Whose house was it? Karpel Schlein, the son of the elderly Fischel Schlein, who was the father-in-law of Fischel Hecht. Now, all of these names are, of course, comical because they are all Yiddish names of fish. Schlein and Hecht and Karpel. Karpel, of course, is a carp, and Schlein is a codfish. So this fellow who loves eating fish and is willing to go against the kind of popular social ban, his name is actually Carp Codfish. At that very hour that the townsfolk were discussing the matter of Karpel and his fish with the rabbi, along came Michal Ber. Now, Michal Ber was not the rabbi, he was the shamus. He's a kind of lay Jewish functionary in town, a kind of gabbai, a kind of officiant in town who doesn't hold his position because of his Torah knowledge per se, but because he's able to help the rabbi in the actual administration and execution of the town. And in that way, this is a story, I say it's a story not about the rabbi, but about the gabbai, about the shamus, about the guy who can get things done. The rabbi has authority, but sometimes the shamus, the layperson, actually has the power. So along comes Michal Ber. When the dispirited townsfolk, people who were upset because the price had not come down because Karpel Schlein, he's buying up all the fish at the exaggerated price, and therefore there's no pressure to lower the rate. When the dispirited townsfolk had gone, our master said to him, I have nothing but praise for the good people of Buchach. They accepted suffering without complaining. And then he tells of other tales in his rabbinate where people would come to him with problems and they would ask him to bring a miracle. And then he says to Michal Ber, what's on your mind? And Michal Ber says, well, I'm thinking about Karpel, this fellow who's breaking the the custom and breaking the ban and is buying fish. He sees everyone depriving themselves of having fish, and he has no compunction about buying some for himself every day. The rabbi says, so what would you have to say about that? What can we do? Reb Michal replied, well, maybe even here we need a miracle. A miracle here? A miracle, however it may come. The rabbi knows that when the townsfolk ask for a miracle, they mean they put their trust in heaven. When Rav Michal Beer speaks of a miracle, he means there's sometimes ways of getting things accomplished which happen in an indirect manner. And of course, the biblical story of the 10 plagues is, in a way, a reflection of that theme. He goes off, this Michal Bear, to see the dean of the fishermen, the elderly Petro, a non-Jew. Of course, his name Petro, which would be the Ukrainian equivalent of Peter. You're going to name a non-Jewish fisherman. Of course, he's going to be named Peter. Petro brought Michal Bear into his house and found a choice place for him to sit. He took a choice fish that he had roasted for himself in oil on the fire and a cabbage leaf. He placed the fish upon the leaf, set it before his guest, Michal Bear, and clucked, enjoy it, your honor, enjoy. It's worth taking a bite of. Michal Bear peered at him once, twice, and sighed. Oy! Petro heard the sigh and was puzzled. He had never heard a Jew sigh like that before eating a meal. If a Jew were to sigh, it would be during the meal, while eating and drinking. For Jews know that they are not worthy to enjoy what God has created in his world. We hear the thoughts inside the mind of the non-Jewish fisherman. This is part of Agnon's narrative style, to give over the microphone, as it were, to the different characters so that we can hear what each is saying, what each is thinking. That is why the Jews sigh when they are served good food. But this fellow here, he sighs before he's even tasted a thing. Petro said to him, Pan Michal, Mr. Michal, why do you sigh? Michal replies, how can I not sigh when you see how lightly you take me? Had you served me a roasted frog and told me to eat it, I would be no more surprised at you. In other words, this very distinguished member of the Jewish community comes into the non-Jewish fisherman's home. The non-Jewish fisherman serves him a plate of cooked food, which is, of course, even if the fish itself is technically kosher, is prepared on non-kosher dishes. Of course, he's not going to eat it. And he says, I'm surprised at you. Were you, in other words, instead, we might have anticipated him saying, were you to serve me chazer treif? If you'd served me a piece of pork, I would have been no less surprised. But here, instead of reaching for the kind of central casting's choice of non-kosher food, pork, if you would have served me a frog, I wouldn't have eaten it. So suddenly the story turns to this subliminal use of frogs as a plot device, and the plot starts spinning around this notion of frogs, and Michal Bear has this poor Petro dangling by a string, almost eating frogs out of his hand as he's placing ideas into his head. He explained to the fisherman that the rabbi had forbidden the eating of fish, and presumably this was going to impact his business. Now, this was not technically true. The rabbi had not forbidden, as a matter of halachic law, eating of fish. He merely advised against it. Petro has a contract. Our friend Karpel Schlein had made an order for 12 large baskets of fish. But now he hears that the rabbi says you're not allowed to eat fish. Eating fish is as kosher as eating frogs. Petro continues, I know you're as smart as any rabbi, and if you say something is true, but what you've said now makes no sense to me. If I give Karpel fish, he won't pay me any money? Are 12 baskets of fish nothing? To this, Michal Bear replied, well, you could argue that as long as fish were permitted to be eaten, they were worth money. But now that they're prohibited, they're as forbidden to Jews as frogs. And if you ask me, I'd say that sometimes frogs are better than fish. The proof of that is in Egypt. The Egyptians suffered a plague of frogs, not of fish. And of course, this harkens back to the midrash that I mentioned moments ago, that even a frog can sometimes be the agent of God's will. Petro sits there stunned. If Karpel is a bandit, he's going to. I've sent my men out to capture 12 baskets of fish, and Karpel isn't going to pay me when I deliver them. He orders 12 baskets of fish. In the end, he won't pay me. Well, tell me, Pan Michal, what does your Torah, what does your rabbi say about that? After all, there are financial obligations that this fellow has to me. Well, said Michal Ber, you should excuse me, but you have a goyish cup. You have the head of a non-Jew. I've already told you that our rabbi has issued a ban on fish, which are to the Jews like frogs, forbidden in the same way, like frogs, Petro, except that fish are food and frogs, God knows why they were created. I have explained all this to you quite clearly, and I don't think I need to add even a croak more. Ribbit, ribbit. What do you want? That I should tell you, for example, to, I don't know, fill your baskets with frogs and send them to Karpel? Advice like that you won't hear from me. Karpel is a Jew, and you, even though you are honest with me, you are a Gentile. I must tell you that I have to be very particular with you. You make me say everything twice. I'm beginning to hear frogs croaking in my head. Frogs, fish, frogs. And as getting paid goes, what difference does it make if it's fish or frogs? Like that old Passover song, frogs here, frogs there, frogs are jumping everywhere. Well, why had Karpel Schlein ordered so many baskets of fish? His son was getting married. He's a very rich man. He's making a wedding. When you make a wedding, you not only have to make a wedding, but you have to make an ofruf. On the Shabbat before the wedding, your son is called up to the Torah, and you have to make a very big kiddush. So his kitchens are busy preparing all of the food for the kiddush before the wedding, to which all the townsmen will be invited, and the story goes on and on. It's one of those stories where you can gain a few pounds just by reading the story, the description of the whiskey and the crackers baked with peppers and onions, and the supply of whiskey and raisin wine and various baked goods, eggs with radishes and onions and chopped liver with onions, and wealthy provide whiskey, raisin wine, grape wine, fish, meat, and other delicacies among the sweet and stuffed kugels, etc., etc., etc. And of course, the piece de resistance was going to be the fish. Now, of course, there's something terribly ironic here. Karpel is making a kiddush. He's inviting the whole town. Everyone is going to be there, shoving and poking and pushing around the tables to get, well, you probably have a sense of what a kiddush is like in synagogue. He was going to be serving the fish that were snuck secretly into his house at night so that nobody should see that he was the one that was purchasing fish, which kept the prices elevated. Well, when they're served on the platter, people will certainly know that he had purchased fish. So the irony is, of course, delicious here. It's almost as delicious as the fish. Agnon knows full well that the townsmen don't want fischel carp buying up the fish and keeping the prices high. But if there's a platter of herring in front of them, they'll be glad to partake. Don't get in between the Jew and the herring on the table at the kiddush. You might get knocked over. So the night before the Sabbath, when all of this tasty repast was going to be placed before the townsmen, the 12 big baskets of fish come into the kitchens, and Karpel is supervising what's happening amongst his cooks and bakers and maids and butlers. He grabs hold of a knife and started cutting around the covering of the basket. The string snapped and the basket opened. When it opened, Reb Karpel was astonished. He was astonished not only at this first basket, but at the second and the third and the fourth and all of them. Why? So as not to tell you each individual basket, I lumped them all together, and you will see that it was not for nothing that Reb Karpel was astonished. You will also understand what I meant when I said that in knowing what happened with Reb Karpel, you will also realize that Petro kept the oath he made not to send him as much as the scale of one fish. But in fact, Petro had sent something. And had he sent fish, Reb Karpel would not have been astonished. But what did he send? he sent 12 baskets of frogs. Not one basket or two, but 12 baskets. And every single one of them was filled with frogs. So it's the night before the Kiddush, and the cupboard is bare, and the only thing they have is frogs. So there was Reb Karpel, his frogs croaking away in the baskets and his anger croaking away with him. He kicked, pay attention to that word, at the basket, and all the frogs promptly scattered. Some expired on the spot, and those that did not begin hopping around, some on Reb Karpel's shoes, and some all over the place. In his attempt to get away from them, he crashed into a basket and overturned it, and all the frogs inside fell out. Those that did not expire on the spot caught their breath and started hopping about in all directions. He tried to take refuge from them and wound up stepping on them and squashing them. The same thing happened to his wife and to the bridegroom. While he was looking to be rescued from the frogs, the head chef came over demanding that he and his colleagues be paid, in the midst of which they all came up to him clamoring for their fee. Reb Karpel shouted, "Scum! You want to be paid for your troubles? The only trouble you took was to enjoy my distress." Now, of course, this is playing off another rabbinic idea, which Rashi telegraphs to us from the Midrash. In the verse in Exodus chapter 8, V'yet Aaron et yado al meimei Mitzrayim, Aaron stretches forth his hands over the waters of Egypt, V'ta'al hatzvardea, and the frog, singular frog, came up and covered the land of Egypt. Now Rashi explains, of course, the word frog can sometimes we use the singular instead of the plural to describe a whole category, right? The class of frogs, the species of frog, the swarm of frog came up. But he also tells us that it was in fact only one frog. The plague of frogs was one, maybe large frog exits the Nile. And what happens? The Egyptians hit it. And every time they hit it, every time they kicked it, it splits into many swarms of frogs. That's the midrashic interpretation. So the scene in the kitchen where Reb Karpel is kicking the frogs, kicking the baskets, and they're multiplying, and there's frogs everywhere, and there's frogs in the dishes, and there's frogs in the food, and there's frogs in the oven, and there's frogs, right? It's informed and playing off of this midrashic idea, which Agnon puts into a 19th century tale in the old world of Buchach. Well, he says, "You want me to pay you?" to his cooks and his butlers and his maids. "Here, I'll pay you with frogs." They say, "You take the frogs and eat them to your heart's content. We want our pay. We want our money." "Money for what? For witnessing my downfall? For witnessing my embarrassment? If the fish turn themselves into frogs, take them to court. Meanwhile, give us our money." They screamed at him. They screamed at them. He screamed at them, and the racket could be heard outside on the street. Passers-by gathered and heard everything. What possessed the frogs to give their lives for the troubles of Buchach? They took their cue from the frogs in Egypt. By the time that people left Reb Karpel's house, the whole town knew that the fish Karpel bought turned themselves into frogs. Now, of course, here's this kind of folk legend which grows immediately before the event is even over. There's an explanation, a supernatural explanation for what had happened. A miracle. You remember that people wanted a miracle. The price of fish wouldn't come down. The rabbi was unable through the halachic mechanism, the legal mechanism, to solve the problem. So they turned to heaven and asked for a miracle. Michal Ber is just the kind of guy who knows for a miracle to happen, sometimes he has to be, or one person has to go behind the scenes to manipulate events so that the rest of the world will see what it was. In fact, it was a miracle. The fish do turn into frogs, but not the way the people think. Buchach was astounded. Some saw the whole thing as testimony to the power of the rabbi. Even though he had not explicitly forbidden fish, he did call for people to cease and desist from buying them. In other words, they mistakenly attribute the success of the endeavor to the rabbi's moral call. Others attributed what happened to Michal Ber. He had said that even in this situation, a miracle was needed. And a miracle did in fact occur, because Karpel ordered fish and found frogs. In other words, they give credit to Michal Ber, but not for what he actually did. Behind the scenes, but for what he said on the surface should happen, which is how they interpret the events. Those who ascribed it to the power of Rabbi Avram said it really testified to the power of Torah. Those who attributed it to Michal Ber concluded that astute people are beloved in heaven, for their wishes are fulfilled. In other words, it's a way of taking the events that surround them and interpreting them through their kind of pre-established values, that this shows the power of Torah, or it shows the power of the righteous for whom miracles are performed. But it doesn't occur to anyone that things got done because a wise, clever, canny person was able to manipulate events behind the scene. And that's the story of the frogs. It's a delicious, delightful example of how Agnon can take both the entirety of the biblical and rabbinic canon, in this case, the verses from the Bible about the plague of frogs in Egypt, and the rabbinic interpretation of how that plague unfolded, and a case that occurred in his town about a generation before he was born, an actual real historical case with historical figures that were part of the legend and folklore of the town in which he grows up, and then to turn it over into a kind of reimagined tale of frogs and fish and miracles and faith. When he's writing the story in the 1950s, he's doing so in the fairly recently established Jewish state, a Jewish state that was experiencing all types of need of miracles sometimes which come from heaven, and miracles which sometimes come from the good works of people down here on earth. But it was a Jewish state which for the first time was taking some of the politics of the Jewish town. Imagine the kind of politics that go on in your own synagogue or local organization. Sometimes they're quite comical. They're things that we could write spoofs of, farces of. We sometimes do that on the holiday of Purim. But that was what Jewish polity was. At most, it was running a synagogue or a small town. And here we're running a whole nation. Here we're running an autonomous, sovereign Jewish state for the first time in 2,000 years. And it's possible that the satire he's making of how Jewish power works and how things really get done is now being reimagined through the prism of a Jewish state at a time when it's a little harder to satirize the actions of Jewish leadership, because the consequences are just so much more colossal when you're talking about the entire state of Israel. And it's possible that he was saying something about Jewish life in the Jewish towns of Europe in the 19th century. He was also saying something about the rabbinic interpretations of biblical texts way back in the second and third century. But it could be, as is often the case with great authors, he was saying something about his own day in the middle of the 20th century. So we commend Agnon's The Frogs to your attention, available in his book in English, A City in Its Fullness.